Welcome to Ladies Talking Love, Season 3, Episode 5, Talking to Kids About Sex, Part 3. It's Ladies Talking Love, a community of women uncovering more joy and fulfillment in sex, as we learn from experts and amazing women like you. Together, let's create a world where women's sexuality is celebrated and understood, beginning with our own. I'm your host, Ariel Finlinson. Let's talk love. Well, this is it, part 3 of our 3-part series about talking with kids about sex. I hope that this series has been helpful. And even if you're not quite at the teenage phase, there were some really great things that were brought up in this episode that you can start integrating even now if you have younger kids. There's always limited time and so many questions that I could ask our guests, but I hope that this interview will cover some questions that maybe you've had about talking with teens about sexuality and about sex. And even though we didn't maybe go as in depth of exactly how to answer certain questions, I hope that the basic principles that are covered will give you a starting point to talk with your spouse about how you guys want to talk with your kids about sex. What type of values are important to you, and how do you want to express those to your kids, and how do you want to encourage them to figure out their own values and figure out how they're going to live their sexuality within the values that they think are important for their lives. Dr. Laura M. Padilla-Walker is a professor in the School of Family Life at Brigham Young University. She received her PhD in developmental psychology from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in 2005. Her scholarship focuses primarily on how parents socialize adolescents' positive behaviors, with special emphasis on parent-child communication about healthy sexuality and pro-social media. Aside from over 100 journal publications, Dr. Padilla-Walker has co-authored a book for parents on how to teach their children healthy sexuality. She is currently serving as the Dean of the College of Family, Home, and Social Sciences. She and her husband, Chris, are the parents of 3 children. Before jumping in, I would just love to ask that if this podcast has been helpful for you, if you could hop on and leave a review, that would be super awesome. It helps other people find the podcast, know what we're about. And this week, as you're listening, if you think of any other parents who would benefit from this series of talking to our kids about sex, I would really appreciate if you could share it with them. But without further ado, let's talk love. I'm so grateful to have Dr. Laura Padilla-Walker back on Ladies Talking Love to talk about teens. This, I feel like, might be the age group that most parents are most worried about talking to kids about sex and sexuality. So to start us off, what specific conversations do you think are really important for this age group around sex and sexuality?
This is the most common question I get from parents. When can I start talking to my kids about sexuality? Again, we've said this on previous episodes, but if you've been talking about it all along, this will be a little bit more smooth, but it's perfectly okay to sit down with your teenagers and say that you want to have more conversations about sexuality. They are certainly learning a whole lot about it in a variety of different places. One of the things here is trying to figure out the temperament of your child and the different approaches you might need to take to these conversations for children with different temperaments. And so some kids, I have parents very often ask me, there's no way my child wants to talk to me about this. They just leave the room. They're really uncomfortable. So a couple of ideas: you can have a jar or something where the kids can put anonymous questions in, and then once a day, we're going to talk about sexuality at least once a day, and I'm going to pull something out of it. And if you don't put questions in, I'm putting questions in. You could make it as easy as that so that
I love that idea.
They don't have to feel the pressure of the questions. Speaking of pressure, you don't want to sit down face to face making scary eye contact and let's talk about sexuality. It's really more effective with teenagers, especially if you're being active or moving around. One great place is driving in the car. They can't escape. They don't have to look at you. But also, you might be throwing the ball in the backyard, or you can just bring this up whenever and often, and not in a way that's like irreverent, but in a way that it's just normal to talk about sexuality and it's okay. And, when you think sexuality, it doesn't have to be about sex. There's lots of different things about your bodies or modesty, all kinds of things you could talk about, dating, that have to all do with this topic, but that you can talk about and make it just a regular conversation in your family. Let them teach you a lesson on it. You might be surprised how much they know. Okay, you're going to teach me about how bodies work and how babies are made. Why don't you teach me that? And you might be surprised how much they already know. And
Whoa.
I didn't teach you that. Yeah. And they'll also, then if you're open with them, they'll have many questions because they'll hear things at school. I mean, I've been shocked with the things my children have come home actually at an earlier age than this. And sometimes, many times, I don't even know what that term means. But what I'll say to them is, you don't go looking up what that means. I'll go figure out what that means, and then we can talk about it together.
Yeah.
Again, you want them to know that you are the place they can come for answers and that you will help them to find answers to their questions. They don't have to go to the internet. And so those are just some things to think of to begin with. How do you even have these conversations? Sometimes you might have a child who's really shy and reserved and one who's really open and asks a lot of questions. That's why you might have the conversations as a family, because, I have one child who will ask 100 questions and the other child isn't asking any questions, but they sure are listening. Having the opportunity where different personalities can interact in a way that hopefully information is being communicated and people are feeling comfortable. They might not feel comfortable at the moment, but the more, and you might not feel particularly comfortable, but the more you have those conversations, the more comfortable it will be.
And what are some examples of topics that you would maybe bring up in the car or in a family meeting? Because I think a lot of parents are like, how am I supposed to talk about this every day? Or, there's,
right. Yeah.
And like you said, there's so many things that are part of sexuality, but it can feel overwhelming.
Yeah. Well, and some of it, again, for you could put topics in a jar, think of different things. It doesn't have to be super planned or structured. And I would actually talk to my kids earlier than teenage year about this, but you want to talk to them about same-sex attraction. You want to talk to them about pornography. You want to talk about masturbation. You want to talk about modesty, dating, all the different topics, again, so that they know they can come to you, but also just so that they understand different people. They might understand themselves. If you have a child who experiences same-sex attraction and you've never talked to them about that, it can be much harder for them to open up to you about what they're experiencing. Just thinking, maybe make a list, about the things you think it would be good to talk about. And it could be anything from body image, things that feel a little safer or easier for you to talk about. And then you talk about pornography or other things that are a little bit, or masturbation that's a little bit harder for you to talk about. And again, when I say talk, these are brief conversations because teenagers, especially, they do not want to be lectured. Actually, no kids want to be lectured. So it should be a conversation. You should be asking them if they have questions. Now, if they're just mumbling and say no, then you might use the media that they're watching to bring up a conversation, or a billboard you pass, or a book that you're reading, or something that their friend said to them. And it can be very brief, where it's not, okay, let's sit down and talk about sex again, because then nobody's going to want to talk about it. Right. Yeah. So it can be casual, brief conversations. And I have the best conversations with my kids when they ask me questions.
Yeah.
And again, that doesn't mean you should wait for their questions, but it's always going to be better if they're a part of the conversation and you're not just if you find you're the only one speaking, you need to pause and back up. I mean, I'm not great at this either. My son came to me with the question the other day, and after he left, I thought I just totally lectured him for 20 minutes on that. I went and found him and I said, I'm so sorry, buddy. That conversation did not go the way that I would have liked it to go. I'm sorry. Are you feeling anything that you'd like to talk about? Do you have any questions? So when we make mistakes, which will be daily as a parent, multiple times a day, the apologies are a wonderful thing. And we can just tell our children, that didn't go how I wanted it to go. Let's try again and we'll get better.
Yeah. And I think that is so important, especially as we've talked about in some of the other episodes. If you haven't started and you have teens, it's like, where do I start? And I love, just like, oh, did you notice this in the movie? Dr. Levitt actually in her episode brought up where it was like, oh, we were watching a movie and a lady who wasn't dressed very much came up, and it was just a great time to kind of pause and say, oh, how did you feel when you saw that image? And just kind of to start talking about in all these different areas, things that they're experiencing. And especially with this age group throughout the teen years, would you kind of have a more in-depth conversation about how intercourse works and our bodies works? Or would you do more of a conversation of like, what do you know? And then just kind of fill in the gaps?
I would probably do both. And again, it depends on where my child was at. One of the things parents don't do as often. So parents are more comfortable talking about sexuality vaguely, but less comfortable talking to the child specifically about their own sexuality. And so at this age, one thing I did, and this might not even be enough, is I would make sure twice a year, I might take my daughter out to dinner and I wouldn't tell her that this is what this conversation is for, but I would ask her about her own sexuality, or my son, and just, how are you doing? And actually with some of my children, it's a weekly, how are you doing? How are you doing with, let's say you're struggling with this behavior or want to do better in this area, I might check in more often. But for sure, I would have told myself, okay, we're going to these 2 times a year, because I know I take them out to dinner and we have these one-on-ones. I'm just going to, do you have any questions for me? And one year my daughter asked me about birth control. And one year my son asked me about STDs and things that I realized were gaps in what I had taught them. And we just had a, 10, 15-minute conversation about it because they asked a question, and then we moved on. But made sure I was asking them about their own sexuality and then any questions that they might have.
I love that, because I definitely fall in, especially with like my line of interest, and I'm looking, I get into the lecturing phase. That's so good to remember. What questions do you have about your body, or what have you heard recently? I think that is such an important point. And with this age group, a big part of, I think, why parents might be more nervous with this age group is especially about arousal. They've come through puberty, maybe starting to date or pair off. What can we talk to our kids about understanding their arousal? We talked about this a little bit in the previous episode, understanding what arousal is and then what to do with it. Like, what do I do when I have this urge to make out a ton with this girl or this boy,
right.
Like, what do I do with these big feelings that are fun and they feel good?
Well, so I have 2 thoughts about that. One is just what you just said, is to help. The first message we need to send them is, this is good. These feelings you have are good and normal and natural. And how do we keep them within bounds? And how do we proactively, what do you want sexuality to mean in your life? What do you want this feeling to mean? What, is it just about how far I can push before I get in trouble? Or is it, you want it to be meaningful? And the other piece that I find is really important, and I've studied this a little bit and care about it a lot at this age, is consent. And actually, I feel like you can start talking to kids about consent from a really young age, like even consent to hug someone or to tickle someone. But when kids are starting to get ready to date, I think talking about arousal and also what that looks like in a mutual relationship or in any type of relationship, is it appropriate for you to hold someone's hand without their permission? Is it appropriate? How would you have your first kiss? What would that look like? And really helping young men and young women understand how to gain consent and how to give or refuse consent, and practice those things together in a variety of ways. It doesn't have to be sexual. It can be, you know what, Dad, I don't feel like having a hug right now. That is perfectly okay. Yeah. Or asking her, don't tell your children, go give grandma a hug. How about, do you want to give grandma a hug? Is that something that you want to do with your body right now? And at this age, when arousal starts to have an opportunity with another person, I think it's really important. And parents, at least in the study that we did on this, they don't do any better job talking about consent than they do anything else. I thought that maybe they'd do better because of all the things that have been going on with the #MeToo movement and other things, but I don't find that they do any better. So you've got a very small percentage of parents who are talking about consent and the importance. And this you can do. It's so easy. Like you see it on TV. So you can watch Disney movies. I mean, I knew I had done one thing right as a parent when my daughter watched Frozen, and Kristoff asks permission before he kisses Anna, and she gasped and said, "Oh, he asked for consent." And I thought, yay, she learned something, versus, Sleeping Beauty, where you can't have consent, right? Clearly there's no consent there. The movies where there's this passionate kiss, and the man never asks for consent. And so then just pointing out, sometimes I'll just say, there was no consent there. I'll just make a little comment, and helping kids understand the movies are not like real life, because kids will say, it seems so awkward to ask permission. It seems awkward because movies are not real life. Yeah. But you don't just kiss someone without their permission. You don't just grab their hand. That's just not how we respect other people's bodies. And so trying to help them understand that, just like pornography distorts what sexuality is, sometimes these romantic movies that we might watch, even Hallmark movies that might seem more rated appropriately, they're not accurately portraying relationships and what they look like. So helping our kids to understand that it's a little more awkward in real life.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like on TV.
And I really liked, there was a talk I was listening to about consent, and he just talked about, would you rather have a little bit of an awkward moment asking for permission, or to kiss them and then realize,
oh my goodness, that's
that
not
was
what I wanted.
Super inappropriate. Like they didn't want it. And so I thought that was good to think about too. Do you talk about with your kids nonverbal consent as well as verbal, or veer toward more verbal? How do you help them know, like, this is actually consent? Because especially in our culture with women's sexuality, a lot of women aren't taught to speak up. And so they might
Right.
seem like they're fine, but really inside they're like, I actually don't want this.
So there's a book that I read. I can't remember what it's called, but the author wrote one for boys and one for girls. And it's for younger kids, but we use this phrase in our house and you hear it a lot. But yes means yes, and everything else means no. And I think that's just the safer way to teach consent, because there is just way too many cases and times where you hear that, well, I thought she was into it, or I thought it was okay. And actually, like you just said, for young women, sometimes they don't know. They don't know if they've given consent or not. They know they don't want to do something, but they feel like they can't say no because then, he won't like them or something. So practicing those, sometimes when our children they say no to us about other things and they're really sort of expressing their independence. Oftentimes as a parent, that's frustrating. But then in a case like this, we want them to be able to exert their independence. I think in those other times, we need to say, okay, this is a child who's learning some boundaries, whether it's about something that's convenient for me or not. And I'm not great at this, so I'm just suggesting it to myself as much as anyone else. But then helping them to see, you can do that same thing. You can stand up for yourself. And if you don't like something, if you're not comfortable, and helping them to think about what it feels like to be uncomfortable and what it feels like to be comfortable. And you might be comfortable and they might not be comfortable. You need to be able to communicate. And what I say to my teenagers is, if you can't talk about it with the person you're dating, you're not mature enough to do it. So if you can't talk about holding hands and how you feel about that, then you shouldn't be holding hands. If you can't talk about kissing and how each of you feels about that, then you're not mature enough to be doing it. So that helps them to, you can't just text about everything. You need to be able to have a conversation. And if not, then you're not ready.
Then you're not ready. That's such a good thing to think about and have your kids be thinking about, like, oh, could I talk about this? And I was talking with a friend recently and she had her first kiss and she thought about it a lot. And I just loved being able to talk with her, like, this is going to be so good. Now you're going to be able to look back and say, like, okay, was this what I wanted? Do I want to do this moving forward? And I think at this age, that's such an important thing to help kids know too, that this is an exploration and they might hold hands and realize, oh, maybe I wasn't ready for that. Or,
that
and just
like too much,
just like a give and take of kind of learning about their arousal and learning what might be too much for them in a certain situation. And how do you kind of help walk your kids through some of those different scenarios, but how do you kind of help them learn to recognize what they are going to be okay with and to stay within their values?
Yeah, it's arousal on a whole different level when you have another individual. So, talking to you might have felt arousal in this context by yourself, but now when you're with another person, you have to pay attention to that. What does that look like? So for some, it might be you feel really aroused when you hold someone's hand. And so that is something where you need to sit with that for a while and understand, is this something that I still feel like I can respect this person and their boundaries and myself, or do I need to back off? And hopefully, if again, maybe we don't want them seriously dating when they're young teenagers, but as they get a little older, it's something you should be able to talk with the person you're dating about. A kiss here and there, it feels really nice, but if we're laying down together, if we're doing other types of things, then here's what happens to my arousal, and I really want to respect you. And so, because boys and girls' bodies are very, very different. And so what might be totally fine for a young woman might be going too far for a young man, or vice versa. So being able to talk about that and say, these are my goals, even my own individual goals. This is what I want sexuality to mean in my life. And this is what I want to save it for. And really focusing with these young people on building emotional relationships before physical relationships, because it's so tricky when you get involved physically and there's not an emotional relationship. Really helping them to understand that the most important part of your relationship is going to be the emotional part of your relationship anyway. So really focus on that. That's why we date lots of different people. We get to know lots of different people. And then if we do become physical with that person, hopefully we're good enough friends that we can talk about it more openly.
And how do you kind of share some of those things with kids? Because I think sometimes as parents, when we say like, oh, you want to really know someone before you decide to hold hands or kiss them, because once you start doing that, you might not see them as clearly, and you really want that friendship and openness. But I think a lot of teens may be like, you're so old fashioned. Like, what type of research or things have you found is helpful to share some of these standards with teens to help them understand why these things aren't just a parent's idea or a religion's idea, but actually can be really healthy ideas?
I'm not sure if research is effective for teenagers. Right? Sure. I mean, because I'm a professor, my teenagers hear about research all the time. And it's annoying to them.
They like shut down,
Yeah.
like I'm turned off. I don't want to hear.
Teenagers, their brains are not fully developed until they're in their mid-20s. And so their ability to think about the future is really different from ours. And so sometimes when we talk that way, it's not terribly effective. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it, but teenagers live in the moment and they're much more impulsive than we are as adults. So talking to them, it has to be their goal and their value and their idea, because values need to be self-generated. And by this age, they should be self-generated. And sometimes the more we try to push our values on our children, the less likely they are to stick. There's plenty of research suggesting that waiting to have sex until you're married is a beneficial thing for a relationship. There's nothing about kissing or holding hands. That level of behavior is not something that research really focuses on. But from a younger age, talking to our children about why they might want to wait to have sex until they're married, why that is a value that is important to us, why that is something that practically, based on research is important, or spiritually, if that's where you're coming from, is important. I think the why behind the behavior is just really essential for teenagers, for all of us, but especially I feel like this generation, just telling them not to do something just because is not working. Not that it ever really worked, but it's definitely not working with this generation. They really need to understand why. And I think parents can share you want to be really careful about this, but I think you can share some stories of your own mistakes you made. Again, you don't want to get into a lot of detail, so that they know that this is hard and this is a struggle that, welcome to the struggle of these strong, amazing feelings and trying to balance relationships. And this is something we all deal with, and it can be really hard. And I'm here for you as you struggle with this. And I'm here for you to talk to and to bounce ideas off and to figure out what you believe and what you want sexuality to be in your life and what you want relationships to be. And this is going to be a little messy and it's going to be a little exciting and fun. And I want to be there with you in this journey. And that feels a lot more comfortable to kids, I think, than a lot of lectures and a lot of punishment. They're just not going to talk to us as parents if that's how we approach it.
Yeah. And as we're kind of closing up, one last question I really wanted to get to is with teens, especially coming from a religious background, I think, especially in the past, it's been a lot of like suppression of these feelings. Mm-hmm. What are some ways you can help your teens understand that there's healthy ways to still express their sexuality, but within their values?
I think that one of the biggest and most important things there, especially when you're coming from a religious approach, is to avoid shaming in any way and just talking about that these are God-given feelings. Just like many other feelings we have, they're meant to be kept within particular boundaries and to help our children understand that what happens more often than it should, and research finds this with people who are conservatively religious, is that they attach shame to these feelings and they're negative and they're bad and you should suppress them. And then when people get married, they're supposed to somehow then suddenly be good and healthy and happy. And that is really challenging for people to make that shift, especially young women, to make that shift of these were bad, negative feelings I needed to suppress. And now they're wonderful, beautiful feelings. So trying to help them understand that it's okay that they have these feelings. They shouldn't be trying to not have feelings. Like we all have feelings. It's just, what is your behavior going to be? And how can we continue to work towards behavior that is in alignment with our values? And really understanding that children will be imperfect. It's really hard for parents. This is like, my baby is no longer a baby, and we want to be in denial sometimes about where our kids are with their own sexuality. But we have to help them. When they're young and they're learning to walk, they're falling down constantly. And we will always be there with a finger to pick them up, or to, more than a finger, just hold them. With sexuality, sometimes we just leave our children without any sort of love and support because it's too hard for us to deal with it, or we don't know, or we're in denial. But we need to be there with them just as much when they're trying to figure out this wonderful power that they have, as we do with any other aspect of development, so that they're much more likely to be healthy in the long run, even if they're struggling with behavior that we don't feel like is ideal. If we can help them understand that any progress in the direction that you want to move for your own values is going to be positive. It just takes time. It's something that is challenging and tricky, but ultimately because it's so wonderful, right? And amazing.
Oh, that is so good. That's like the perfect way to wrap this up about teens. I love that. Yeah. Just let them make mistakes, but be there just like you would when your baby's learning to walk, learning to talk. Where can we find you and more of your work?
Well, I'm not really on any type of social media. We do have a book, and so it's called A Better Way to Teach Kids About Sex. And so you can read that, and I think it does a nice job. My co-authors wrote most of my favorite chapters, and they do a great job talking about all different aspects of sexuality and how we have sample conversations in there. Yeah, I have a bunch of students who are online. There's lots of great resources you can look to. So you can start with our stuff, but there's lots of other things that are really great. And And then you can just decide what information works best for you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'll make sure and link that book in the show notes so people can access it. Thanks so much for awesome conversations.
Thanks, Ariel.
I definitely needed a reminder of some of the points that we covered with Dr. Padilla-Walker, especially the lecture part. I feel like I am really bad at that if it's a topic that I'm passionate about and my kid asks a question 20 minutes later, I've been talking for 20 minutes and they haven't said anything. And so really letting your kids be involved in the conversation and asking them what questions they have was a really important reminder for me. I really liked the idea as well that she talked about having a jar where kids can put anonymous questions in. And if they don't put questions, you can put questions in. I have done that before with teenagers, and I think that was really helpful because there might be some questions that they feel embarrassed to ask, or they heard something at school and they're nervous about asking it. But the jar helps provide a safer way that they can ask those questions that they're maybe nervous about. Something else I thought was really important was talking about consent, and especially the part that yes means yes and everything else means no. Just because there's silence, it doesn't mean that that's a yes. And I think that that's a really important thing to stress. And you can do this with even young kids. I feel like I've had multiple occasions where my kids will ask for permission for something and I'm distracted or busy and I don't answer. And then they go ahead and do it. But I didn't say yes. Silence doesn't mean yes. And so helping our kids understand that from a young age, I think can be really impactful in their life for boys and girls to realize that silence doesn't mean yes. Two more of the points that really stood out to me were to look for examples in movies and media that our kids are watching or consuming, because this can be a really great way to just make those little comments. And like we talked about in the previous episode, just starting that kind of conversation and questioning in our children's mind. Oh, that wasn't consensual. Or, oh, why do all the women look like this? Or, oh, why did it just go up and down that woman's body? Or why are guys always kissing girls without asking for consent? Just whatever it is, it's a great way to kind of point out examples of things that we want to show them and want to teach them in media. And it's present everywhere. Just like Dr. Padilla-Walker said, you can watch Disney movies and talk about a lot of the things that you may want to cover with your child. The last thing that I really appreciated was her point that we need to allow our kids to make mistakes and then be there for them. Learning about our sexuality, especially as a child and as a teenager, can be really hard. And it's a lifelong process to learn about our sexuality, to accept it, to see it as something good and beautiful, and a way that we can connect when we're older with our partner. And as a child, and especially as a teen, it's going to be a trial and error for them. They are going to make mistakes in this area. And instead of expecting them to be perfect, I think it's so important to talk with them that this is a process and they're going to figure it out as they live it. That as they feel arousal, they're going to figure out what to do with that arousal to channel it within their values as they practice. And we can give them some of those tools as we talk with them about mindfulness and about not needing to end the cycle and things like that. But they will make some mistakes and they might realize, oh, I held this person's hand and I realized maybe that was too much for me, or I kissed. And so they're just allowing our kids to practice and make those mistakes, but be there as a sounding board for them to talk about what they're learning and to talk about how they might want to do things differently in the future to match what their values are for themselves in their future life, I think can be really impactful. I hope that this episode gave you some great conversation points to start talking with your partner and figure out how you want to approach these topics with your kids. As always, thanks for talking love. Thank you to all of you who listen and join me on this journey, and to our Ladies Talking Love team who make the podcast possible. Thanks to our sound wizard, Brett Hansey, our newsletter guru, Lauren Barton, and our miscellaneous task whiz, Jana Norman. As always, thanks for talking love.